What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hapness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Lindsay Uittenbogaard, and we speak about alignment and misalignment, the consequences, some results, and how to facilitate the process. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, why don't you visit workshops.work and download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy. Hello, Lindsay, and welcome to the show.
Hi there.
I am looking forward to explore the topic of misalignment.
And
Pardon me?
And alignment, indeed.
And alignment, exactly. And before we get there, I always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Well, I don't, actually. I partly don't call myself a facilitator because I realize how much skill goes into it that I'm not best disposed to, even though I have facilitated and do sort of work around the field of facilitation. I don't work directly really in the field of facilitation. I wouldn't call myself a facilitator.
Wonderful. So how would you call yourself?
So I suppose I'd call myself an entrepreneur because I'm running a business that provides reporting data around alignment for facilitators to use. And that's a very pioneering area because we're kind of discovering it as we go along.
So now I'm even more curious to hear from you what you mean by misalignment or alignment so that you can actually capture it in data. Because my first question would be, is it qualitative or quantitative data, and how can you measure it?
Okay, well, it's both qualitative and quantitative. What we do is we define alignment as how much common ground there is between how people perceive things, because the way that people perceive things is their reality. And when you compare the way that people perceive things by looking at either how they rate certain statements or how they respond in texts and the meaning of those responses, you can see the extent to which their responses converge or diverge. And that gives you an in to how aligned they are. Now, the trick here is that what's aligned or misaligned is often invisible because by nature, alignment sits between people. It's not something that somebody themselves thinks. It's about what the meaning that is shared between people. And you don't often know where that is. So we've designed our question sets to cover the whole system of what could be in somebody's whole work world, so that when they are answering, if there is misalignment, it will come through and be discovered in those comparing of responses. So alignment data is about the extent to which people's views converge or diverge, and you cannot predict where that is necessarily going to be because you don't know until you discover it.
This makes perfectly sense. And I love how you say that alignment or misalignment is it's kind of the vacuum between people, because very often I think I have the impression that we live in the ignorance of misalignment because we think that we are speaking about the same thing because we are using the same words. And then we agree until we do, and then realize, okay, maybe we didn't agree before because otherwise the outcomes would be aligned.
Well, it's really easy for people to talk across purposes and believe that they're aligned because people will understand meaning within the frame that they are putting it in. So if you have an understanding about what something means, you will hear everything in that frame unless it's challenged. And so people can easily speak at cross purposes and not understand where they're misaligned indeed. And the other thing about alignment I think it's important to point out right now is that it's not about people necessarily agreeing with each other or thinking the same thing. It's about people having coherent views that are compatible, because otherwise, how would people be able to bring their diversity and build on each other's points of view? And so where alignment is a kind of state and a process. So alignment is a sort of state of compatibility, but because things are always changing around us and new ideas are forming and, that state can change, there's also a process piece. That's the kind of facilitated bit that you would run with alignment data about where there is alignment or not. And the whole thing for me on shared meaning came up, really the penny dropped when a colleague of mine from a company I was working with was talking about the difference between dialogue and conversation. Real dialogue is about people sharing meaning between each other rather than transacting or learning from one another in just a simple exchange. So it's about building shared meaning. And then you think, well, gosh, actually communication and a conversation is also about shared meaning, but it's about building shared meaning together rather than one person just telling the other. And that's what alignment is all about, because then you're saying, well, if your view is this and my view is this, who's to say that my version of reality is wrong, unless, of course, factually there's something that needs correcting. But often, there's different ways to facilitate alignment, but one of those ways is about blending two things that themselves are both true, two or more things that are both true, into a new reality, a shared reality that combines them both. So that's really about dialogue and shared meaning and alignment and everything else, which, is so fundamental because it underpins all of our decisions and actions.
Absolutely. And misalignment can lead to tremendous mistakes and failures if not pointed out early enough. And I would wonder, what kind of misalignments do you perceive, the major misalignments? And are there maybe different categories where you say, okay, misalignment on a process is something that maybe is not major and we can work around, whereas a misalignment on purpose and vision or roles can really bring a team or a company down?
So misalignment we define as being when there is not coherence between views, when they are pulling in different directions. So that is, another word for that is conflict. So it's conflict in the way that people perceive things. And it does sit underneath every problem that exists ultimately, because, whether somebody thought that a certain part in a process or a machine would work, or somebody thought the requirements for a part in a machine, or whether somebody thinks that the aim of something is to do something differently, or the way that something would be done. All of these things you can categorize into cognition and to behavior. And some of the small misalignments, lots and lots and little misalignments, I don't think there will ever be a complete alignment within a team. But there could be a lot of very small misalignments that would contribute to a team problems, or there could be a key one. And typically what we find is that there are very obvious, significant misalignments, and then there are smaller ones that aren't really worth the time actually to spend on dealing with. And so if you look at alignment from a cognitive point of view, that would be about how they understand their purpose, how they understand their vision, how they understand what's happening together, how they understand where they're going. The behavioral alignments can be much, much more specific around, and the research tells us that behavioral alignment sits in learning behaviors. So the more that people have learning behaviors in the areas of, for example, psychological safety and interdependence, the more likely they are to be able to open up to each other's perspectives in order to be able to learn from each other, in order to be able to accommodate each other's views and align for more effectiveness. So learning behaviors determine the extent to which teams can become effective and through alignment. And obviously, the extent to which people can share an understanding, their cognitive alignment, is fundamental to how they understand their perspectives and how they will go on to be effective again. So understanding where those differences are and how they sit in data will reveal what needs to be discussed. And again, we then come into, that leads on to then how do you facilitate alignment with those insights?
Intriguing. And I wonder, what I hear is a knowing doing gap. So we might cognitively know that we are misaligned and that there needs something to be done. But then to actually go through this behavioral adjustment, I wouldn't say behavioral change, but at least adjustment. What makes it so complicated? Maybe even to start the process?
Well, I think what makes alignment complicated is that forever people have tried to sort it out using words in conversation or trying to observe things. And you can get really tied up in knots because especially in complex situations with diverse people where there's a lot of change, conversation is almost a barrier to trying to sort out alignment because there's political sensitivities. People will take conversation onto different levels. So 1 minute we'll be talking about, well, what do we misalign on? And then, well, why is that? And well, where did that come from? And then how do we know that? And, the conversation can become so laborious and time consuming when it's difficult to see the benefits that the difficulty with alignment is, quite frankly, how to understand where those alignment gaps are. And like you said, on the behavioral side, if you get very specific, for example, about psychological safety, can we raise difficult issues and questions? That's one aspect of psychological safety. And you can take psychological safety into, say, 5, 8 aspects. And then you ask people to provide their views on the team, on what's happening between the team, what the dynamics in the team on each aspect. And then you can really measure what people observe and experience in the team on that specific point on psychological safety so that you get very quickly to the nub of what is it that we are doing that is helping us in psychological safety? Where are the scores quite good? And where do the scores need improvement? And maybe there's quite a lot of misalignment about that. But that's as deep as it goes. So as soon as you can see, well, let's take again that indicator. Can we raise difficult issues and questions? Supposing the average result is set 60%, and you think, oh, that's not too bad. But then the spread of scores in that goes from 0 to 100. There's a lot of misalignment on that. So you can say, is this worth us talking about? And then if so, what do we need to do to have everyone feel comfortable with the fact that they can raise issues and questions? And you get right into the point of what needs to change for this team to be more effective on that indicator, which is a key part of alignment for effectiveness.
And I wonder, I would be very curious to hear how you then facilitate the process of getting out of the catch-22, where a team has identified that psychological safety is an issue where they're not aligned. And then in order to speak that out and to discuss it and find a solution, you, per definition, need psychological safety.
Yeah. And so there are ways, and I'm certainly not the expert to ask, but from what I understand and from my own experience, there are ways to bring people into a culture bubble, a kind of bubble of a culture where they can feel safer by themselves articulating and making up what ground rules would help them with this. So what we do, for example, is, and what I do is I give facilitators templates for how they could do their stuff. So I know about the process of facilitation, although that doesn't necessarily make me a great facilitator, which is why I don't call myself one, but the method that we would teach facilitators is to start off by asking a group of people, okay, what would make a great conversation? What would make an effective dialogue? And have them tell you, and they'll tell you immediately things like, listening, not talking on behalf of others, leaving status at the door, making sure that you don't interrupt, asking why to get under the skin of what the assumptions are at play. And by the time they've kind of gone through it, everybody really knows this, but putting it into practice in a working environment where you're tainted by the culture and the day-to-day kind of mental progress and mental noise that has to go on, you have to take them out of that and into this little space that says, okay, for this next hour, we are going to practice these ground rules. And it makes a huge difference, especially if they feel that the team leader is maybe very dominating or something, maybe not having the team leader present for that dialogue. Or maybe having the team leader practice that in the dialogue. Whatever works for that team, I would prefer the team leader to be there, but whatever works for that team, is get them into a space so they can have a safe conversation like that.
Yeah, and I can imagine that it would unveil lots of cognitive dissonance, because nobody wants to be the person who doesn't listen. So I think I can imagine that when a team collectively writes down these ground rules, everyone would check the box and everyone would say about themselves that they're respecting the boxes, because nobody says, oh, I bring my ego and my status into the room.
Right? Yeah, it does get really messy because, you can have people with the best intentions going out into a breakout group with those ground rules, only to find that 10 minutes later, they're all talking on top of each other because they're so passionate about what they're saying and it all goes out the window. But as a facilitator, that would be a skill that you would have to bring, which is how do you rein back a team without actually causing offense to anybody, especially if they're a senior executive team who don't like being told to shut up and think that when they're given an answer to a question, it's got to be about 5 minutes long, which cannot happen in an effective dialogue. So that is the facilitator role. The facilitator role is looking at the alignment data, but not necessarily making an opinion about what that means, because it really depends on the team context as to what the problems are. So, for example, not being able to take risks in a conversation, maybe that's okay with them. It depends what kind of business they're in. Who knows? I doubt it, but there are always situations where the alignment data will give you the door to open the conversation, but it won't tell you how to consult the team to tell them what to do. And the key thing about facilitating alignment is that people have to make sense of things on their own terms in regard to what makes sense to them, which is why it has to be facilitated. It cannot be a consulting gig. You cannot say to people, okay, we've got this report here, you guys need to do this differently. They're not going to align to that. That's just telling them what to do. So alignment is about having people open up to hear the views of others, be able to share their views, be able to hear them, accommodate them, and build a better shared understanding. That's what alignment is all about. And the facilitator, A, as you've said, would need to get them into a safe space for that. But B, then give them back different pieces of the data, let them really sink into, well, what is our current reality, and discuss that. And then, well, what do we need to change to move on to create our new reality, which is to make progress, presumably, and perform better, or, reach better results, or accommodate some kind of change, or whatever it is. And that is very valuable, but is the piece that we're talking about around facilitating alignment, that process. And there's different ways to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's starting with data, with quantitative data, is always a good way to get the group to focus on the problem and not on each other. And I'm saying that because I can imagine that there's a lot of confusion around, and you mentioned something that triggered this thought, around alignment, which is two or more parties accept different realities, and convincing. I convince you that my reality is a better reality. Do you observe this confusion? And how would you deal with that? What's the real difference? Because if you have to work together, maybe sometimes there are situations where can you force someone to align? I think you cannot force someone to agree, so you cannot convince someone.
No, and that comes back to the fact that people don't have to agree, but they do have to agree on a course of action that they all support. And it helps, I think, to give some preamble prior to the alignment process around, well, what is the nature of alignment? What is the beast of alignment that we're all trying to understand how to work with so that our process is as effective as possible? Part of that is about the fact that alignment recognizes that everyone has a different mental model in their mind about how the whole world works, that is based on a whole intricate web of lines of logic that connect with each other based on what we've learned in the past and the conclusions that we've drawn based on everything from our experiences and beliefs and biases and personality and everything that we bring to the world. And alignment maybe involves one person agreeing that one connection of logic needs to be replaced with a different connection of logic in order for something to work. They're not replacing their whole selves. They don't have to give their whole view up. They don't have to, it's not about who's right and who's wrong in such binary terms, but it's just about everybody making little adjustments so that they can get behind the same decisions. One of those adjustments might be, I don't have to be right. I just have to be committed to the team. Another adjustment might be, okay, I'm going to give up on the fact that we have to do something this way, because if we do it that way, at least they'll be happy. And because everybody's got so many kind of logic connections in their brain, we're only talking about tweaking things here and there in everybody's mental models so that things become better aligned. That's one way of doing it. And then the other thing to impress on people is that alignment can be also through clarity, because if people have a clearer idea of what the strategy actually means in their context, or a clearer idea of what different options could look like in delivery from which they're going to pick one, they are changing their perspective on things. Again, they're changing their mental model of how they're viewing their world at work. And clarity is a way for alignment to work. The way forward that we just discussed around alignment was building a bridge between two perspectives. When two things can be true, and how do they add up together and how can they combine? That's another way. But another way to do it is to park the ones that are quite difficult and not put them in a whole group discussion. Sometimes it is a bit of a mediation where maybe long held beliefs or things that need a lot more information or investigation need to be taken offline. Then it turns into a bit of a project. It's like, okay, we all need to learn something here because it needs more investigation, or these two people need to go off to explain to each other why it is that they are wanting to go in different directions and then how they're going to work that out. So you can do things in the workshop, you can take it offline, you can turn it into a project, you can get more clarity. So all of these different there are four means for people to align is an explanation that you can give people up front so they understand the process they're in. It's not then a personal confrontation.
Yeah, and this is what I was thinking, that you have, when you look at alignment, it's on the one hand, it's a process where you first have to identify where is alignment needed, then gather the data to identify how large is actually the gap. And then you have people issues by definition. So that's where the psychology then comes in, and how to deal with these people issues and make sure that they do find a way to align for the better future.
On the things that are important to align on.
Yes. According to you, what would be something that is maybe overstated? That I can imagine that there are teams who think that it's very important to align on some issues, but it's actually maybe irrelevant or just covering something deeper. What would be an example for you that is when misalignment is just normal and can be parked?
I think there's two different questions there, actually. Firstly, to your point about people, it all does come down to people. I mean, even artificial intelligence, the decisions made around where to put that, how to use it, what it can result in, how it's being monitored. Everything comes down to the decisions that people make and the actions that they take. An example of a misalignment that let's say is normal, that causes a lot of problems, has been in a group of teams that I worked with in a self-managed organization who felt that they were extremely advanced because they had virtual teams working on different projects with people switching projects on innovation topics in different countries with different nationalities in a self-managed environment, which is really up to date, of course, but is a massive hotbed for misalignment because so many things there's so much scope for people to interpret things differently. And after working with the teams, to cut a very long story short, it boiled down to the fact that the understanding of what self-managed means there was a conflict there. The leadership teams thought that they shouldn't provide any guidance because the teams were supposed to be self-managed. The teams felt overworked because they couldn't prioritize because they didn't know the broader context. And so while everyone was trying very hard and was very committed to the organization, the teams didn't know what to work on and what to prioritize because that they weren't getting the guidance they needed. And actually what they agreed to do in the end was just to have quarterly conversations, not where people are telling other people what to do, but just to discuss the context and discuss what logical priorities there could be per team, per quarter, so that everybody's expectations were managed and everybody could then get on with the stuff that they knew that was expected. And had they not reached that conclusion, they could have gone on for another year, all being overworked and annoyed with each other, with a real us and them mentality coming up. So in that sense, the expression of the alignment was in a very us and them, frustrated, overworked, overcommitted workforce who were beginning to ebb away at their performance because of the issues that I've mentioned. Mm. That would be the symptom of misalignment. I mean, basically, if things aren't going smoothly and if you're not getting the results that are expected, there is misalignment. So that's the kind of thing that will come up on a number of different levels with teams.
Very interesting. And it seems like, or I can imagine that most of the misalignments might actually come from not having the same understanding by the words we're using, like self-managed. What does self-managed actually mean in practice?
Yeah. And a lot of it comes also from bias about what people want things to mean. To different motivations. Like there was a phrase going on in an organization I worked in, which was, we're going digital. What does that mean? What does that mean and there are people in the technical department had a different understanding from those in the sales and marketing department. People in the communications department thought that it was much more about the branding and the customer face. I mean, it was all over the place. And those things, it's entirely possible for that kind of unclarity about the meanings of words to just never be resolved. And how much is that worth, if you think about it?
Yeah, totally. And then I wonder, when we look at the vision or mission statements of, let's say, I have no idea, surely above 60% of the corporations or companies, full of buzzwords. So basically, they invite for misalignment because digitalization and safety or trust and transparency and customer first, service oriented, all these buzzwords, everyone per definition understands something different around it.
Yeah. And I suppose the thing is that it necessarily does mean something different to different people when they're working for different goals. So service oriented to the IT department will mean something very different from, say, the legal department. What does that look like? How does that translate? And because a lot of communications, I'm only talking from a position of authority here because I worked in corporate communication for 15 years before I went into this alignment work. A lot of the issues there inspired me to go into this work because I could see that there was a gap between what the strategy messaging, and effective action. And the gap between that is about relevance and tailoring to context that a lot of organizations aren't doing because they can't think of a way to do that is scalable or quick enough. But I suppose my response to that is that a well-structured, well-facilitated, managed dialogue to help people align doesn't take a long time. We're talking within hours. You can get teams onto a totally different footing because they are better aligned.
Greetings, listeners. This June, Dancing with Markers is launching a new online self-paced course on visuals designed with facilitators in mind. Stop making boring, meaningless slide decks and start bringing visuals into your meetings in a fun, purposeful, and creative way that will have a real impact on improving the outcomes of your meeting. Visuals are central to facilitating engaging meetings, but so many facilitators and trainers lack a strong design muscle to create fun and purposeful flip charts, slides, and visual templates. For the facilitator who wants to incorporate better visuals into your meetings, this course is designed to transform you into a confident visual facilitator. Find the link to purchase in the show notes with a special 10% off coupon just for Workshops Work listeners. Now, back to the show.
How granular does the alignment need to get? And I think especially from a communications perspective, and to pick up your example, service-oriented for IT is very different than for customer service, than for delivery and for the communication and for HR, because their service is inwards oriented towards the employees and not the clients. Can there be an effort of over-alignment and thereby sucking the energy out and the creativity and the self-expression?
Yeah, so there's a very good question on can you over-align? And I'd say that you need enough alignment data that is specific to the group of people that you're talking to. So you really do need to align people in teams because that's where they share a context. That's where they share a goal. So you need enough alignment data to open the door to a conversation where a lot of other things will come out that you cannot discover in advance. Otherwise, everybody would be spend their time answering surveys the whole time. So you need enough alignment data to open the door, but not so much that you're going to be too biased in the way that you're trying to inform people to support the alignment. So that's why we have kind of structured question sets that follow the same pattern pretty much per team, although they can customize to situations. For example, for new teams or executive teams or virtual or remote teams. But the question sets are usually the same because that gives a standardized approach to measuring and repeating that over time. So, for example, what is the purpose of your team? What is happening in your organization that is impacting your team? What kind of impact do you think that is having? What concerns you? These are the kind of questions that when you compare the responses, they give enough information to have teams go, oh, I didn't realize they thought this, or oh, well, actually, if I think about it, I suppose my answer is that, when you wouldn't normally maybe have had an answer because nobody tends to stop and ask these questions. Some of them are asked at an employee survey level, but I have a bit of a problem with employee surveys in the sense that they're not so oriented towards discovering what needs to rise. Rather, they are more oriented to provide results and feedback on particular topics, and the results aren't activated and used directly with the teams that could make change with them, with the data there. So the over-alignment would be groupthink. Over-alignment would be when people have talked about things so much, they've all persuaded themselves that they're in so much union that they are actually blind to other perspectives. And that, again, is a facilitator's piece. So the sweet spot, if you like, is to have a constant creative abrasion and a constant constructive challenge, whereby people are, by nature, putting different points of view forward in order to keep moving forward, but not so much so that they all end up in some place that's alienating other ideas.
Yeah, I had the impression, and it's a gut feeling, and I have observed it over the past year since the pandemic started, that the working from home environment is amplifying everything that hasn't worked before already. So is it something that you observe as well? Because I can imagine that since the pandemic, your phone doesn't stop ringing because everyone now realizing that they weren't aligned, because before the office chat and all the social activity would cover that.
Well, it's certain that there is more misalignment around when people are working remotely because they're less able to read signals and body language and catch people for ad hoc conversations to check off what they think against what other people think. And there is a body of research around social constructionism that shows the way that people construct their reality is done through language with others, and that they don't just sort of have an own opinion that hasn't been sense checked and measured against other people's perspectives. And that in the remote working world, we are far less able to do that. So there's actual data on the fact that people are something like 2.5 times more likely to perceive mistrust and broken decisions and poor commitments from their colleagues than they would have done. And they take 5 to 10 times longer to address those. So that's what's happening. But a lot of people still don't associate misalignment or the practice of alignment as a way through that. So for sure, there are a lot of people, we are more relevant than we were before, but I wouldn't say that alignment has come to the point where people recognize the point at which to use facilitated alignment to help with their effectiveness in mainstream at all.
Yeah, two thoughts come to my mind. One is that what I hear from you now is actually it's not necessarily an amplifier, but there is indeed a higher risk of misalignment due to the virtual interaction because of the missing social connection and social clues. And the second one is that we might have just a very high misconception of what alignment means. And when I say that, I think of meetings with the topic or purpose alignment meeting. And what often happens is one person says something, the other person says something else. And then maybe, especially when it's online, they only understand or hear half of it. And then this is alignment where actually both just drop their information. So what would you advise to demystify alignment or to educate people what actual alignment means?
So the people in the example that you mentioned are probably realizing that maybe they're not on the same page, let's put it, to use a coined phrase, and are trying to align. But I suppose I would say that it would be better to have a focused, proper alignment session once every 6 months, and to check that, use a pulse check and check it, and to use tools, because then you are properly aligning, and then you go getting on with things, and then you need to properly align again and get on with things, rather than say, oh, let's have a conversation now about alignment. Well, all conversations are about alignment. That's what people are trying to do. It's just that they're not working and it's not effective because we're so far down the track of virtual, complex, dynamic, diverse contexts. It's difficult. Some people do align, of course. Not every team is misaligned. But I would say if you're going to do alignment, do it properly and do it regularly. But the second thing, I suppose, is that there are different levels of alignment. There's alignment of the strategy, the purpose, the strategy and the systems so that the organization itself is as an entity aligned. And then there's employee alignment to the strategy. And then there's employee alignment to each other in terms of how they collaborate to deliver. So there's 3 different dimensions of alignment. And what we've been talking about in this podcast is about the latter 2, about how people understand the strategy and how they will understand each other to deliver better together. Now, I think it's important for people to be clear on and to understand and at least talk the same language on alignment itself, which is what does alignment mean and at what level are we trying to improve our alignment? Because then immediately you can focus the conversation down to something that's much more productive than just talking about everything. And if people are attempting to sort out alignment in conversation, let's not get caught up in who thought what and why necessarily. Let's just pick either what do we mean and where are we going, rather than all of the other myriads of sub conversations that can go on around that. It needs a lot of focus.
And it sounds as if it needs a lot of definition work. So when you say A, I understand B. Do you mean that, or is it me?
It is a lot about definitions, and taking the time to realize that by talking about definitions and by going back to ask the basic questions, that's not going backwards, and it's not a waste of time. It is really important to reflect. And one of the things that happened over the course of the last 12 months over the pandemic has been that every single team that we've worked on from different parts of the world have had 2 behavior scores in the bottom 5 that have been the same. And those 2 behavior scores are clarity on direction and remit and sufficient reflection on progress, which basically means that regardless of what culture these teams are from, And regardless of what industry or level of seniority these teams are in, when we look at the behavior scores that we talked about in those different categories, we come up with the bottom 5 behaviors. And when people are working remotely, they find it difficult to anchor onto the clarity and direction, clear on direction and remit, onto the direction and remit that the team is supposed to have. And that's because of the thing that I was talking about before, where people's biases and their motivations will drive them to slowly deviate the meaning of what they understand as they go along, because that's what they want it to be. You know, our team is going to the direction and remit of our team is, and that can morph over time with different people. And in remote contexts, that's obviously it's among the lowest scores. I mean, we have teams with sort of 20% average scores for that. And then the second one is reflection on progress, which is what alignment is doing. Alignment is saying, where are we now? What is the current situation? It's reflecting on where we are now and where are we going? So those two things are there.
Which is shocking because it just cries for burnout. Because if I don't sense the progress I'm making, then I feel frustrated. And if because of the lack of communication, the team is misaligned and don't understand what the actual purpose is. So if you don't understand the purpose or the common role or mission, then of course everyone is running in different directions. And then by definition, they don't feel progress.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head in the sense that misalignment, the feeling of misalignment is frustration. Because you don't know why it doesn't feel right. You don't know how to sort it out. You're just not going in the same direction and things are going wrong. So it takes twice as much effort to maybe go 3 steps backwards. It's a really frustrating thing to the point where I think we think our mission with alignment is to help people become less frustrated, work and feel more rewarded. Not necessarily financially, but they can have a much more rewarding time if they're aligned.
Yeah. I would have 2 questions. One, if you could advise a team leader who is now sitting with a virtual team, what are maybe 3 questions, the standard question that they could check alignment just for a little temperature check? And what are the big risks when trying to align a team if you don't know how to do that? Because I think as much as with air quotes, bad facilitation, you can destroy a lot. And I think many are not aware of the damage. I can imagine that in the area you are working about alignment, you can also make some mistakes that do more harm than good.
Yeah, I think the 3 most important alignment questions, if you can get people to answer honestly, because the other benefit of a tool is that people can submit their answers anonymously so they don't fear their consequence of their responses, would be, what are we trying to achieve? How are we trying to achieve it? And do we feel that we can challenge each other constructively?
Refers to the safe space.
Yeah. And the risks of having an alignment conversation are that if people don't behave in that discussion process in a way that supports alignment, i.e. they don't listen and they try to tell other people what their points of view are and etc., it can just feel more frustrating. I think a perceived risk is that you open a can of worms. And what we found is that the can of worms is far scarier in concept than in reality, because the moment that you start to address real issues and you start to put the real topics on the table, people feel a bit of a sense of relief. And it actually can move people much more towards being engaged as an outcome. The engagement is an outcome of alignment, because then they are really talking about what matters rather than leaving a mess in the middle of the room and not clearing it up and pretending it's not there. So the risks are that people might not participate because they have the fear of the conversation, and that if the process isn't a high enough quality, they might just come out just feeling a bit more frustrated. That's, I guess, where we're going.
And when you say that the process is not facilitated, what would you say are one of my standard questions is always, what makes a workshop fail? So what would lead to this frustrated group of participants in your experience?
I suppose there's a number of things, but one of them would be that they're not given the opportunity to make sense of things on their own terms. Everybody has a different way of understanding things. And if they are simply told something in a language that doesn't make sense to them and they're not able to answer questions, then they're not given answers to questions that make sense to them. It's like that phrase, we're going digital. Well, yeah, but what does that mean I'm doing differently then? Okay, well, okay, so what does that mean to our team? Well, it means we're going digital, of course. I mean, you've got to get used to a digital way of working. Yes, but what does that mean? Unless people are getting answers in the ways that make sense to them, it can feel more frustrating.
Mm.
So, but that's down to, again, that comes down to the need for objective facilitated. I keep using the words facilitator, but because I believe that the alignment process should be done properly and in a high quality way so that it is as effective as it can be with the least resources. And then you do need a facilitator to hear what somebody is asking, see the response that somebody else who's in their own construct at work, people in the team and the team leader, they can't be so objective because they have all of this baggage and ways of looking at the team
inside the can, so they cannot see the label, right? So they are part of the misalignment,
everybody
alignment. So it's difficult to facilitate something that you are emotionally and professionally involved in.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, because they'll have their own words and they'll think other people think these words mean those words. And yeah, it's very difficult to be objective when you're in it. And it does take somebody objective to hear what's being asked. I mean, something that's quite useful is clean language. You've probably come across that in all of your podcasts, that clean language is a great way to, if you haven't already got that, I would definitely look into it because it's a great way for people to be asked questions with minimal bias.
Mm-hmm.
A great way for people to respond in a way that can be most easily heard.
Can you give an example?
Oh gosh, I'm not a clean language expert, but an idea might be, I'm not sure if this is right, but one example might be, do you think the purpose of this team is to support the company strategy? That's not very clean because you're basically giving them bias in the question.
It's not a question, right?
The open, clean question would be, what do you think the purpose of the team is?
Mm.
But there's a whole body of sort of thought around that. But it's apparently there's an entire movement around it that I stumbled across in the process of looking at alignment, but never heard of it before because
I haven't.
No, which I was totally surprised about. So I can give you a contact for that.
Yeah, and I will put the link in the show notes. I guess there must be something on the internet.
Yeah.
If you have a link. Do you have a simple exercise that one can do to align or to check alignment? Do you have a favorite exercise that you would do with groups?
I don't actually, because I'm never in a situation where somebody's going to ask me to check whether they are misaligned, because that would be before they would think about alignment. But one thing that we do is that we look at silos and animosity and blame. And if you can see a lot of silos, people working separately, kind of again, without enough collaboration, and a bit of animosity, well, they said, and that team, and well, those leaders. And the minute that you have blame, well, must have been the leadership, that provider, the minute that you have silos, animosity or blame, then you have the symptoms of misalignment. And the minute that you have people who are feeling that frustration we were talking about, that is a way to diagnose whether or not alignment is needed.
And then we have 3 sample questions to check the temperature. And what would be a normal percentage? What is the percentage of misalignment that you would consider, okay, that's normal, and oh, now you should worry?
Well, I think it's in the extent to which the team feels something is needed, some change is needed. I mean, if everybody's quite happy, I wouldn't say that there was a need to, but if people feel that they're not getting enough results for the effort that they're putting in, then alignment is probably something that they can use.
And a final question. When I think about the results that you get, so you ask the open-ended questions and you get different answers from different members of the team or corporation, and then you compare them in order to find out how aligned these answers are. Would you do this exercise then with a client from the corporation to really, because again, sometimes they might use different words but actually mean the same, or they might use the same words but mean different things, which then is just noise in the data.
When people express their responses, we don't ask for a single word, we ask them for a whole response. So, for example, what is the purpose for your team? Again, let's go back to that question. The way that we put those into a report and compare them is to do what we call coding, where you take the meaning, and if somebody had said, our goal is to swim the ocean, and somebody else had said, our goal is to swim a long distance, the meaning is similar. So we will chunk them up to the highest level of meanings to match the meanings up. And then you can see that they're both talking about swimming a long distance, regardless of whether it's defined as the ocean or not. That will go into a graph. It might be against somebody else's definition, which is to fly across the ocean, in which case that's a different legend text. When the group is reading the legend text, we're not going to give them, that's why you can't really draw any hard and fast conclusions from alignment data alone, is because we're not going to give them the answers as to exactly where they're misaligned. But if you read that in the context of your work, you can see that actually there's a conflict there. Some people think they're swimming and some people think that they're flying. Maybe they should check that off and discuss it.
And I assume that you have a machine learning or analytics tool that would do that.
No, AI is not at the point where it can do that. So we have a process to code the qualitative answers by hand, which is what makes us different from your average answer these 20 questions online and get an automated report for $5, thing, because that'll give you some interesting data. But we would consider ourselves to do the deep dive, to go in to do a high quality job, get a proper report at the other end. And that's how we are offering our services.
Thank you for clarifying that. I'm glad that I asked the question, because I think there might be some first attempts with word recognition and pattern recognition and machine learning. But then again, we have an algorithm behind that was coded by human beings. And so I'm glad to have the answer. If someone fell asleep after minute 2, just woke up and doesn't have time to listen to the entire show again, what would you like them to take away?
I would like them to take away the fact that alignment is never going to happen completely. It is key to decisions and actions, so it underpins a lot of problems. That you can discover misalignment by looking at the extent to which there are silos, there is animosity, and there is blame in the organization and frustration, and that you can organize alignment that doesn't take much time and it doesn't cost much money, but it does have a lot of results.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experience and expertise with us.
Thank you.
Hoping for more alignment.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Marian.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.